The bright lights of the CNN studio cast long shadows across the polished table as makeup artists made final touches on the panel guests. Karoline Leavitt sat quietly in her chair, reviewing her notes one last time. At just 26 years old, she had already made a name for herself as one of the youngest White House press secretaries in American history, and today she was representing the Trump administration on one of cable news's most watched programs. The studio buzzed with activity as camera operators adjusted their equipment and producers whispered final instructions to the host. Karoline could feel the familiar tension that always preceded these high-stakes television appearances. She knew that as a young woman defending controversial policies, she would face skeptical questions and likely some hostility from both the host and other panelists. Across the table, 3 seasoned political commentators shuffled through their own preparation materials. Sarah Mitchell, a veteran Democratic strategist with silver hair and sharp eyes, had been a fixture on cable news for over 2 decades. Next to her sat Dr. Marcus Rivera, a political science professor who had written extensively about media manipulation in modern politics. The third panelist, James Crawford, was a former Republican congressman who had distanced himself from Trump after January 6th. The show's host, Rebecca Stone, was known for her aggressive interviewing style and her ability to create viral moments that would dominate social media for days. She had built her career on these confrontational exchanges, and Karoline was well aware that she would be walking into hostile territory. As the countdown began, Karoline straightened her blazer and took a deep breath. She had prepared for this moment, studying every possible angle of attack and crafting responses that would not only defend the administration's positions, but also appeal to the millions of viewers watching at home. She understood that this wasn't just about policy debates. This was about narrative control in an increasingly polarized media landscape. The red light on the main camera flickered on, signaling they were about to go live. Rebecca Stone looked directly into the lens with her practiced television smile, ready to begin what would soon become one of the most talked-about panel discussions of the year. None of them could have predicted how dramatically the next hour would unfold, or how Karoline's response to their attacks would reshape the conversation about media bias and political discourse in America. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal the deep divisions not just in American politics, but in how different generations approached political communication and media manipulation. What started as a routine panel discussion was about to become a master class in political strategy and media savvy. Rebecca Stone's opening monologue set the tone immediately. Her voice carried the weight of moral authority as she addressed the camera, outlining what she called troubling developments in the Trump administration's latest policy announcements. The graphics behind her flashed alarming statistics and provocative headlines, creating an atmosphere of crisis and urgency. Tonight, we're joined by White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt to discuss these concerning trends, Rebecca announced, her tone already suggesting that Karoline would be defending the indefensible. The camera switched to a wide shot showing all 4 panelists, with Karoline noticeably younger and more isolated than the others. The first question came like a guided missile. Rebecca leaned forward, her eyes locked on Karoline with the intensity of a prosecutor cross-examining a hostile witness. Press Secretary Leavitt, how do you justify the administration's continued support for policies that experts across the political spectrum have called divisive and potentially dangerous? Karoline had expected this approach. The question was designed to put her immediately on the defensive, forcing her to justify rather than explain. She smiled calmly and began her response. But before she could finish her first sentence, Dr. Rivera interrupted with a scoff that was clearly audible to viewers. "I'm sorry, but we can't continue to pretend that these are normal policy disagreements," Rivera interjected, shaking his head dramatically. "What we're seeing is a systematic assault on democratic norms, and frankly, I'm surprised anyone is willing to defend it on national television." Sarah Mitchell nodded approvingly, and jumped in before Karoline could respond. The polling data is clear. Americans are tired of the chaos and the constant controversy. Even many Republicans are starting to distance themselves from this administration's more extreme positions. Karoline recognized the coordinated nature of their attack. This wasn't a spontaneous discussion. It was a carefully orchestrated ambush designed to overwhelm her with multiple accusations simultaneously. The strategy was obvious. Keep her so busy defending against one attack that she couldn't effectively counter the next one. James Crawford, the former Republican congressman, delivered what was clearly meant to be the killing blow. As someone who served in Congress for 12 years, I can tell you that what we're seeing now isn't conservative governance. It's something else entirely. And those of us who still believe in traditional Republican values have a responsibility to speak out. The message was clear. Even Republicans didn't support Trump anymore. Karoline was being painted as an isolated defender of an indefensible position, outnumbered and outgunned by respected voices from across the political spectrum. The panel's body language reinforced this narrative. They sat forward, engaged and confident, while the camera angles made Karoline appear smaller and more defensive. But Karoline had been in situations like this before. She understood that television was as much about optics and timing as it was about the actual content of the discussion. While her opponents had played their opening moves aggressively, they had also revealed their strategy too early. Now she knew exactly what she was dealing with, and she began to formulate her response accordingly. The discussion took a sharp turn when Rebecca Stone decided to make it personal. Her professional mask slipped slightly as she leaned back in her chair, adopting a more casual posture that somehow made her words more cutting. Karoline, you're young, you're smart, you have your whole career ahead of you. Don't you worry about how defending these positions might affect your future credibility? The question hit differently than the policy attacks. This wasn't about political philosophy anymore. This was about Karoline's personal integrity and professional judgment. The implication was clear. She was either naive, opportunistic, or both. The other panelists exchanged knowing glances, sensing blood in the water. Dr. Rivera piled on immediately. That's exactly the question many of us in academia have been asking. How do bright young people get drawn into defending positions that are so obviously problematic? It's almost like watching someone sacrifice their intellectual honesty for short-term political gain. The attack was sophisticated in its cruelty. By framing their criticism as concern for her future, they were simultaneously questioning her intelligence, her integrity, and her independence. Sarah Mitchell nodded sympathetically, as if she truly felt sorry for Karoline's situation. "I've seen this pattern before," Mitchell added, her voice dripping with false compassion. "Young staffers who get caught up in the excitement of working at the highest levels of government, but who don't fully understand the long-term consequences of the positions they're being asked to defend. It's really quite tragic." Karoline felt the familiar surge of anger that came with being patronized, but she had learned long ago to channel that emotion into focus rather than letting it show on her face. She recognized this tactic. They were trying to provoke an emotional response that would make her appear defensive or unstable on camera. James Crawford delivered what he clearly thought would be the final blow. "The tragedy is that there are legitimate policy positions worth defending, but when you tie yourself to someone who generates so much controversy, you lose the ability to have those substantive discussions. You become defined by the chaos rather than the ideas." The panel's strategy was now fully revealed. They weren't just attacking Trump's policies, they were attacking Karoline personally for choosing to defend them. The message to viewers was that any reasonable person would distance themselves from the administration, and Karoline's continued loyalty was evidence of either poor judgment or moral compromise. Rebecca Stone sensed the moment was right for the kill shot. "Karoline, be honest with our viewers. Do you ever have moments of doubt? Do you ever wonder if you're on the wrong side of history?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The camera zoomed in on Karoline's face, looking for any sign of uncertainty or regret. The other panelists leaned forward slightly, confident they had cornered their opponent. The studio fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of producers murmuring in the control room. This was the moment they had been building toward, the moment when Karoline would either crumble under the pressure or lash out in a way that would make her appear unhinged. They had pushed her into a corner where any response would seem defensive, and they were waiting to see which way she would break. Karoline paused for just a moment, letting the weight of their attack settle in the studio air. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and completely different from what anyone expected. Instead of defending herself or getting emotional, she smiled slightly and looked directly into the main camera, speaking to the millions of viewers rather than to her hostile panel companions. "You know what I find interesting about this conversation?" she began, her tone conversational rather than confrontational. "We've been talking for 15 minutes now, and not one of you has asked me about the actual policies we're implementing or the real results we're achieving for American families. Instead, you've spent this entire time questioning my character, my intelligence, and my future." The shift in energy was immediate and palpable. Rebecca Stone's confident expression flickered with uncertainty. Dr. Rivera stopped shuffling his papers. Sarah Mitchell's sympathetic smile froze on her face. They had expected defensiveness or anger, not this calm redirection of the entire conversation. Karoline continued, still speaking directly to the camera. "The American people watching tonight don't care about my personal career prospects or whether I have moments of doubt. They care about whether their jobs are secure, whether they can afford groceries, whether their children will have better opportunities than they did. And on those issues, the issues that actually matter, this administration has delivered results." She turned to face the panel for the first time since beginning her response. "Dr. Rivera, you mentioned polling data earlier. Let me share some polling data with you. Unemployment is at historic lows. Manufacturing jobs are returning to communities that were written off by previous administrations. Small business confidence is at levels we haven't seen in decades. But somehow, none of that made it into your opening questions." James Crawford tried to interrupt, but Karoline held up a polite hand and continued. "Mr. Crawford, you talked about traditional Republican values. I'd argue that supporting policies that help working families keep more of their paychecks and create opportunities for their children to succeed, those are pretty traditional values, regardless of which party is implementing them." The dynamic in the studio had completely reversed. Now the panelists looked defensive, while Karoline appeared confident and in control. She had transformed what was supposed to be an interrogation into a platform for her own message, and she was just getting started. "Sarah, you mentioned that Americans are tired of chaos. I think what Americans are really tired of is being told by media panels like this one that they should be upset about their improving economic circumstances. They're tired of being lectured by people who live in Washington and New York about what's good for communities in Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin." Rebecca Stone finally found her voice. "Now wait just a minute," she began, but Karoline smoothly cut her off. "Rebecca, I know you want to get back to talking about controversy and personalities because that's what drives ratings, but the people watching tonight deserve better than that. They deserve to hear about the policies that are actually affecting their lives, not speculation about my career prospects or psychological analysis of my motivations." The control room was buzzing with activity as producers scrambled to figure out how to handle this unexpected turn. Their carefully planned ambush had been turned inside out, and their star panelists suddenly looked like they were the ones being interviewed rather than conducting the interview. The atmosphere in the studio had completely transformed. What began as a coordinated attack on Karoline had become an uncomfortable examination of the panel's own tactics and motivations. Rebecca Stone made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "You're deflecting from legitimate questions about the administration's conduct," she said, trying to sound authoritative but coming across as defensive. "The American people have a right to know about the character of the people making decisions that affect their lives." Karoline's response was swift and devastating. "The American people absolutely have that right, Rebecca, and they exercised it when they elected President Trump. Twice, as a matter of fact. What they didn't do is elect you or this panel to make those decisions for them." The words hung in the air like a thunderbolt. Dr. Rivera's face flushed red as he realized the implication of what Karoline had just said. She wasn't just defending Trump, she was challenging the fundamental premise that gave the media panel its authority to sit in judgment. "But that's exactly the problem," Sarah Mitchell interjected, her earlier false sympathy replaced by genuine irritation. "Voters can be misled by misinformation and propaganda. It's our job as journalists and analysts to provide context and hold leaders accountable." Karoline pounced on the opening. "And there it is. Voters can be misled. In other words, you believe the American people are too stupid to make their own decisions. So you need to make those decisions for them. You need to tell them what to think, how to vote, who to trust." The accusation was like a match thrown into gasoline. James Crawford tried to object, but Karoline wasn't finished. "This is exactly why trust in media is at historic lows, because instead of reporting news, you've appointed yourselves as the arbiters of truth. Instead of presenting facts, you're presenting interpretations. Instead of informing voters, you're trying to manipulate them." Rebecca Stone's professional composure finally cracked completely. "That's absolutely ridiculous. We're providing analysis and context that viewers need to understand complex issues. That's what journalism is supposed to do." "No, Rebecca, that's what opinion shows do," Karoline replied calmly. "But you present yourselves as journalists while you're actually functioning as political operatives. You invite me on this show not to have a genuine discussion about policy, but to create a spectacle. You coordinate your attacks, you interrupt my answers, you question my motives instead of addressing my arguments. That's not journalism, that's theater." The camera captured the uncomfortable expressions on the panelists' faces as Karoline continued her systematic dismantling of their approach. Dr. Rivera made one final attempt to salvage the situation, his academic credentials lending weight to his counterattack. "Ms. Leavitt, you're essentially arguing that any criticism of the administration is illegitimate. That's a dangerous position that undermines the role of free press in a democracy." Karoline shook her head with a slight smile. "Dr. Rivera, I'm not arguing against criticism. I'm arguing against deception. There's a difference between legitimate journalism and what we've seen here tonight. Legitimate journalism would have started with questions about policy outcomes, economic data, and legislative achievements. What we got instead was a coordinated character assassination disguised as political analysis." She turned back to the camera one final time. "The viewers watching tonight are smart enough to see the difference. They can recognize when they're being manipulated, and they can make their own decisions about who to trust and what to believe. They don't need this panel to think for them, and they certainly don't need to be lectured about their political choices by people who clearly have their own agenda." The studio fell silent except for the mechanical whir of cameras and the distant sound of nervous activity in the control room. The panel that had begun so confidently now sat speechless, their carefully planned ambush turned into an embarrassing exposure of their own bias and manipulation. The segment ended abruptly as Rebecca Stone, clearly flustered and unable to regain control, announced they were going to commercial break earlier than scheduled. The camera lingered for just a moment on the uncomfortable faces of the panel before cutting away, but that moment was enough to capture what would soon become one of the most shared political clips of the year. In the control room, producers scrambled to figure out what had just happened. Their carefully orchestrated takedown had not only failed but had completely backfired, turning their own show into a platform for the very message they had tried to suppress. The show's executive producer stood watching the monitors with his arms crossed, knowing that this segment would be dissected and analyzed for weeks to come. Back in the studio, the panelists sat in awkward silence as makeup artists touched up their appearances during the commercial break. Dr. Rivera stared at his notes, realizing that all his prepared talking points now seemed petty and small compared to the broader points Karoline had made about media manipulation. Sarah Mitchell checked her phone and saw that clips of the exchange were already being shared thousands of times across social media platforms. James Crawford, the former congressman, found himself in the uncomfortable position of having been outmaneuvered by someone half his age. His decades of political experience had been neutralized by Karoline's strategic thinking and media savvy. He had expected to face a typical White House spokesperson reading from talking points, not someone who could turn the entire premise of the show against itself. When the show returned from commercial, Rebecca Stone's energy was noticeably different. Gone was the aggressive confidence of the opening segment, replaced by a more subdued and professional tone. The remaining segments felt anticlimactic after what had just transpired, and viewers could sense that something significant had shifted in the dynamic. Within hours of the show's conclusion, clips of Karoline's performance were trending across multiple social media platforms. Conservative commentators praised her strategic dismantling of what they called mainstream media bias, while even some liberal observers grudgingly admitted that she had effectively exposed the panel's coordinated approach. The hashtag #ButCarolineShutdown began trending on Twitter, with users sharing their favorite moments from her counterattack. News websites scrambled to analyze what had happened, with some calling it a masterclass in media strategy and others defending the panel's approach as legitimate journalism. Political strategists from both parties studied the clips carefully, recognizing that Karoline had demonstrated a new template for dealing with hostile media environments. Instead of playing defense, she had gone on offense. Instead of accepting the premise of her questioners, she had challenged their authority to set the terms of the debate. The long-term implications were significant. Other Trump administration officials began adopting similar tactics in their media appearances, turning interviews into opportunities to critique media bias rather than simply defending policy positions. The traditional dynamic between journalists and political figures had been fundamentally altered. For Karoline personally, the appearance became a defining moment in her career. She had proven that youth and intelligence could triumph over experience, and preparation when combined with strategic thinking and moral clarity. The young press secretary who had walked into that studio as the target of a coordinated attack had emerged as a formidable political communicator who couldn't be easily dismissed or manipulated. The CNN panel, meanwhile, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating opponents and the risks of allowing political bias to become too obvious. What was supposed to be their moment of triumph had become their moment of exposure, broadcast live to millions of viewers who could now see exactly how the media manipulation game was played.